You're 54 years old. It's 9:50 on a Sunday night, and you're standing in your kitchen, phone in your hand, thumb hovering over an app you've had installed for 11 years. You don't open it. Instead, you set the phone face down on the counter, next to the coffee maker you'll use in 8 hours, and you just stand there for a second in the quiet. No notification sound. No red circle with a number in it. Just the hum of the refrigerator and the sound of your own breathing. Your name is Mark. Somewhere in the house, your wife is watching something on her tablet. Your son, 22, is a closed bedroom door and a set of headphones. And you're standing in a kitchen at 9:50 p.m., feeling something you can't quite name, except that it feels a little like relief and a little like being left behind, both at once. 3 years ago, you deleted the apps. Not out of a plan. Not a New Year's resolution. Not a digital detox with a hashtag. You just stopped. One by one. Quietly. No announcement, no goodbye post. You simply logged off and never really logged back on. And here's the part almost nobody talks about. You're not alone in that kitchen. There are millions of men exactly like you, same age, same silence, same quiet exit from a culture that never stopped to ask if they wanted to leave. Part 1. The exit nobody noticed. We've been trained to expect withdrawal to look dramatic. A man storms off the grid, buys land in Montana, throws his phone in a lake for the cameras. That's not what actually happened to Mark, or to men like him. Nobody threw a phone in a lake. There was no manifesto. Picture Mark 2 years earlier in his living room, scrolling before bed the way he did every night. Thumb moving, eyes moving, nothing landing. He'd scroll for 40 minutes and be unable to tell you, if you asked, a single thing he'd actually seen. Faces. Outrage. Something for sale. Another face. He'd put the phone down feeling like he'd eaten a meal made entirely of static. One night, he just didn't pick it back up. This is not a man who couldn't keep up with technology. Mark built spreadsheets before spreadsheets were easy. Wired his own house for Ethernet in 2003. This is not nostalgia for a simpler time, either. Mark isn't naive about the past. What actually happened to Mark, and to a very specific generation of men his age, is quieter and more serious than either of those explanations. A slow, cumulative recognition that the culture being offered to him no longer had a place in it that felt like him, and rather than perform belonging he didn't feel, he simply stepped back. This is not bitterness. This is not being anti-technology. This is not a personal failure to adapt. And it is happening to an enormous number of Gen X men, for reasons that go far deeper than any single app or platform. Part 2. The generation built for self-reliance, living in a culture of performance. Here's the first hidden cause, and it's rooted in how Gen X was raised in the first place. Mark was a latchkey kid. Both parents working, a key on a shoestring around his neck, hours of unsupervised afternoons before anyone called it a parenting style. Gen X, more than almost any generation before or after, was raised on self-reliance by necessity. Figure it out yourself, don't make a big deal of your problems. Competence is the whole point. Now picture that same man at 54, watching a culture built almost entirely around the opposite instinct. Broadcast the feeling, announce the struggle, perform the identity, narrate the day. Not because that instinct is wrong, but because it is foreign to how Mark was built. Researchers studying generational identity describe Gen X as the generation caught structurally between two enormous cultural machines. the institution-trusting, image-conscious boomers before them, and the terminally online identity-as-performance culture that came after. Gen X grew up analog and adapted to digital as adults, fluent enough to use it, but never raised inside its emotional grammar. This is why Mark can build the spreadsheet, run the Ethernet, understand the technology completely, and still feel like a foreigner in the culture built on top of it. It was never a skills gap. It was a values gap, and nobody ever named it as one. This is not because Mark failed to evolve. This is because an entire cultural operating system changed underneath a generation that was never asked if they wanted the upgrade. Part 3. The economics of being forgotten. If fault line 1 is generational psychology, fault line 2 is coldly practical, and it's the one that stings the most quietly. Mark is 54. He is, by nearly every cultural and marketing metric, invisible. Advertisers chase 18 to 34. Platforms optimize engagement loops tuned to younger attention spans and younger anxieties. Workplace culture increasingly centers language, tools, and social rituals built by and for people 15-20 years younger than him. Labor researchers have long documented what's sometimes called the middle-age employment penalty. Workers in their 50s facing measurably longer unemployment stretches than younger peers when displaced, alongside a cultural narrative in tech-adjacent industries that quietly codes experience past a certain age as legacy rather than senior. Picture Mark in a Tuesday meeting, watching a 29-year-old colleague casually reference a platform, a trend, a piece of internal shorthand that the whole room nods along to, and Mark nodding too, a half-beat behind, doing the math on whether asking what it means costs him more credibility than pretending he already knows. This is not a personal failure to keep current. This is what it feels like to be a demographic a culture has quietly stopped designing for, while still expecting you to participate in it fluently. Logging off, for Mark, was never really about the apps. It was about refusing to keep performing fluency in a culture that had already decided, somewhere unspoken, that men like him were the audience it left behind. Part 4. The quiet grief of disappearing community. Here's the fault line that's hardest for men like Mark to say out loud, because it sounds, on its surface, like nostalgia, but it isn't. Mark's early adulthood had physical infrastructure for male friendship that has since quietly disappeared. The union hall, the softball league, the garage, the local bar where the same 6 guys showed up every Thursday without having to schedule it. Social researchers tracking the decline of American third places, the informal gathering spots outside work and home, have documented a steep, sustained drop across exactly the decades Mark has been alive, replaced not by new gathering spaces but largely by nothing, or by digital platforms that substitute visibility for actual presence. Picture Mark at 51, realizing he has 340 connections on a professional networking app and cannot name 3 people he could call at midnight if something went wrong. This isn't a complaint about phones ruining friendship. That's too simple, and Mark knows it. It's something sadder and more specific. The culture handed him a replacement for community that looked similar on the surface, feeds, followers, comments, but didn't perform the same function. It offered visibility instead of witness, broadcasting instead of belonging. So when Mark logged off, part of what he was doing, without fully naming it, was refusing to keep mistaking the replacement for the real thing. This is not weakness. This is a man noticing correctly that something was sold to him as connection that never actually delivered it. Part 5. The identity that wasn't for sale. The final fault line is the deepest, and it's about identity itself. Modern culture, especially online, runs increasingly on self-presentation, curate the feed, manage the brand, perform the version of yourself that gets engagement. Mark was raised and shaped across decades of adult life around a very different model. Identity as something demonstrated through action and consistency, not something announced and refreshed. Picture Mark being asked, gently, by his son why he doesn't post anything. No photos of the fishing trip, no update on the new deck he built himself over 6 weekends. And Mark, struggling to explain that the deck already means what it means. Posting it wouldn't add anything to it. It might, in some way he can't quite articulate, subtract from it. This isn't a moral judgment on people who do share their lives online. Plenty of Gen X men do, comfortably. But for a specific subset, men like Mark, the entire logic of performing identity for an audience runs directly against how their sense of self was built in the first place. Privately, through doing, not through display. So the quiet exit from modern platforms wasn't a rejection of technology. It was a refusal to convert a private, action-built identity into a public, performance-built one, because doing so felt, correctly or not, like a kind of self-betrayal. This is not because Mark is antisocial, or afraid, or stuck in the past. It's because he is protecting the one part of his life that still feels entirely, unquestionably his. Part 6. The stacking moment. Now put all 4 fault lines together, and stand where Mark stands, phone face down on the kitchen counter. He was raised by a generation that valued self-reliance over performance, and then handed a culture built almost entirely on performance. He is a man in his 50s inside an economy and a media ecosystem quietly optimized for people 20 years younger, expected to stay fluent in a language he was never taught natively. He watched the real physical infrastructure of male community quietly vanish, replaced by a digital substitute that offered visibility without ever delivering belonging. And underneath all of it, he is protecting a private, action-built sense of self against a culture that keeps asking him to convert it into something public and disposable. No single one of these pressures would explain a man logging off entirely. A person could tolerate feeling a little out of step, could adjust to being marketed past, could even mourn the loss of the Union Hall and still find new ways to connect. But they didn't arrive separately. They arrived stacked across the same 20 years, compounding quietly, and that is the real architecture behind what looks, from the outside, like a man who just doesn't get technology. He gets it completely. He looked at what it was actually offering him, weighed it honestly, and decided it wasn't a fair trade. Part 7. The Reframe. Here's the sentence that changes everything about how we should see men like Mark. This was never a retreat from the world. It was a refusal to keep performing a version of belonging that never actually belonged to him. The old story says a man who logs off is falling behind, stubborn, afraid of change, unable to keep up with a moving world. The true story is nearly the opposite. Mark didn't fail to adapt. He adapted with full clarity, looked closely at what the adaptation would cost him, his privacy, his sense of earned identity, his time with people who actually know him, and made a deliberate trade in the other direction. Psychologists who study identity across adulthood describe this kind of move not as withdrawal but as values consolidation. The point in a person's life where, instead of chasing every cultural current, they start deliberately narrowing their attention toward what actually holds meaning. It isn't decline. It's discernment, arriving exactly when a person finally has enough life behind them to tell the difference. Back to the kitchen. You're 54 years old, standing in your kitchen at 9:50 on a Sunday night. Phone face down on the counter. For a moment you felt like you were being left behind. But sitting with it a little longer, something else surfaces underneath that feeling, quieter, steadier. You didn't lose the culture. You looked at it clearly, maybe more clearly than most people your son's age have had the chance to yet, and you chose something else on purpose. Tomorrow you'll wake up, make the coffee in that same kitchen, and drive to work in a world that still, mostly, doesn't know how to see men like you. That won't change tonight. But you'll know something they don't yet, that logging off was never the absence of a life. It was you, quietly, deliberately, choosing to actually live in the one you already had. You pick the phone back up, just to check the time. Then you set it back down, screen still dark, and go to bed.